Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Don Wolfensberger. I direct the Congress Seminar Series here, and I'm your moderator today. I'm going to recognize you in just a few minutes. But for those of you who are new to the center, let me just briefly explain what we are about. The Woodrow Wilson Center was created by an act of Congress in 1968 as a living memorial to our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson, who remains to this date the only president to have earned a Ph.D. Before he became a governor of New Jersey and president, he was a scholar, a teacher, president of Princeton. And he believed firmly in the idea of bringing together scholars and politicians, the thinkers and the doers, and the belief that both would benefit from an exchange of ideas on issues of the day. And that's what Congress had in mind when they created the Wilson Center as a living memorial. We have about over 800 meetings a year in these facilities, so you can imagine the amount of interaction that does go on between the scholars, the policymakers, journalists, businessmen, students, the general public. Today we're very pleased to host a book discussion for the book Obama in Office that's co-sponsored by the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University under the able direction of James Thurber, who also happens to be the editor of this book, and we'll hear from Jim in just a couple of minutes. We're also very pleased today to host the 2011-2012 class of the American Political Science Association's Congressional Fellows under the able direction of Jeff Biggs. So I'm going to yield 30 seconds to Jeff to just say a few words. Jeff, please come forward. Take the microphone, please. We're on a live webcast here.
I arrive at this occasion with a certain bittersweet feeling. One, I want to thank Don for once again routinely providing our congressional fellows with such fabulous programs. Congress has the unerring ability to constantly do things that need interpretation and explanation. And the Congress Project, under the able leadership of Don Wolfensberger and initially by Lee Hamilton, who had hosted a congressional fellow every year he was in Congress and is still on our advisory board. I'm particularly delighted when I look at this panel and I recognize that Barbara Sinclair, Ron Elving, and Jim Thurber are among our best alumni of the fellowship program, so I know it's going to be good. I have the terrible sense that down the road we're going to find that a retrospective judgment should have been the foresight judgment, because I think you're going to leave a gigantic hole in this community, and we're going to miss you. And as a token of all the congressional fellows in the future who won't be able to be under your great mentorship, I'd like to present you with a congressional fellowship.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would all the congressional fellows please stand so we can welcome and congratulate you?
The entire audience.
Thank you very much. You'll be pleased to know you make up half the audience at this point, so it's a very good showing. For those of you who don't know, what Jeff was referring to was that my seminar series is going to be terminating, not today. I've got another 3 programs next year in January, March, and May on the issues of foreign aid, trade, and energy. I was almost going to say I forgot the third one, but it's energy. But this is part of our Congress and Global Challenges series, so I'm going to be around for a little bit yet. And then I will be sharing time here at as a senior scholar at the Wilson Center, as well as going down with the Bipartisan Policy Center. So with that, let me get on to introduce our co-sponsor, Jim Thurber, who is going to sort of set up the program as both the editor of the book, as a chapter author, and as someone who organized this whole project to begin with, to let us know just a little bit about his center and also how this book project came about. Jim? We could open this now.
Right. Thank you, Don. It's a real honor to be down here and to have the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Congress Project support this activity. I've been to many of your forums. I've participated in several of them. I think everybody on the panel has, and they're always the best in town, and there's a lot of competition going on at other institutions, and we appreciate all of that. I remember meeting with Lee Hamilton when he was still a member and talking about what he would do after he retired, and he talked about coming here, and he talked about doing something related to Congress, and boy, do we miss him. The new director's great, but we miss Lee, and we will miss the Congress project, and it is bittersweet to be the fourth before the end here in terms of the presentation. Let me just tell you a little bit about the book. It's a strange beginning. This book started as a result of a conference in Sharjah. Now, how many of you know where Sharjah is? Don't be bashful. Come on. How many of you know where Sharjah is? Okay. It's part of the United Arab Emirates. And the leader, or the Sheikh of Sharjah, started a university there that American University helped start. And we helped him for 10 years. Beautiful place. And he's had 3 conferences on American politics. I was called and said, will you set up a conference on American politics? And I said, yes. And they said, well, can you invite several people? So in the end, about 2/3 of the authors of these chapters were invited to go to Sharjah. Long ways to give a paper. But along the way, we visited Oman. Now, 2 people are laughing because in Oman, we were up in the mountains, and I always like to do these adventurous things, and we were going through the mountains, and we saw that there was a way to get out of Oman back into Abu Dhabi, but we didn't realize that we couldn't get across the border. They would not allow us across the border, and so all of us spent probably 16 hours in a van waiting to get permission to cross this border because we couldn't go back over the mountains because of this particular problem with our van. At that time, we all discussed our papers, right? No. We were a little bit shook up. Anyway, we became close friends. The book has a variety of perspectives on the election and public opinion from the election into governing and what happened to public opinion after Obama was in office. And we have Gary Jacobson and Richard Boyd using data from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study to look at polarization, public opinion, and public opinion about race, which is very important. A lot of people don't write about that. We also have Steve Wayne on President Obama's personality and his performance. He has a book out from Congressional Quarterly. I recommend it to all of you for Christmas presents, for your aunts, uncles, everybody. Right, Steve? Buy multiple copies.
Or Hanukkah.
It's not at the airports quite yet. Jim Piffner wrote about the organization of the White House, the czars in the White House. Quite a good contribution, in my opinion. And Barbara Sinclair here today wrote about Obama and the congressional leadership. And John Owens from the United Kingdom wrote about Obama in the partisan context that he has on the Hill and the strategies used to pass some of the legislation, healthcare, the failure of cap and trade, climate change legislation, and financial reform. We also have in the book a piece by me on Obama and lobbyists, his attack on lobbyists. The congressional fellows in here know about this. Don't worry, I'm not going to repeat it again. They've heard a presentation on my findings there. There have been many unintended consequences of attacks on lobbyists. As a result of that, I write about that. Ron Elving talks about how he'll tell you more today and bring you up to date, but how the media loves to fall in love, especially this was so with Obama, and then they fall out of love very quickly. Did I take everything away from your presentation? Good. And he writes about the relationship of Obama and the media. Scott Lilly evaluates Obama's communication style and finds it lacking, as many people have since Scott published this, but he was the first, in my opinion, to come out and analyze that. He'll present later also. We have material on domestic policy and foreign policy, Joe White on the budget, my wife Claudia on the politics of regulation, and Doug Van Halen on internet policy, and on foreign policy, John Wilkenfeld, Martha Crenshaw, Pius, and Korb and Rothman. So The book is structured around several questions, and I'll be very brief, and then we'll go into the panel, and then I'll come back to some of the material in the book later on. A central theme of many of the people in the book was how did President Obama react to the crises that he inherited and that occurred during his presidency. How did he make decisions? Steve especially looks at that, but others do too. And how does he make policy? How does he communicate? How did he campaign, and how did the campaign differ from governing? How does he lobby? How does he work with Congress? And what has been the impact of Obama's presidency so far on policy process and the politics, especially with the Hill, but the projection of electoral politics in 2012. If you look at, and very briefly, and then I'll hand it off, if you look at what he has done, he's been quite a consequential president. There's a lot of criticisms now, and I guess I'd like to say that if the economy was going very well right now, we'd all think he was brilliant, let me tell you. But it is not going well. Remember that he had the stimulus package. He continued to administer TARP. He bailed out the automobiles, and that's going to hurt Mitt Romney if he gets the nomination in Michigan. I was just in Michigan. John Kingdon's shaking his head. But my friends in Michigan are saying that Mitt's statement against Obama on this is hurting him in that state. Healthcare overhaul, major overhaul of the healthcare system on cost, quality, access, and finance. Financial sector re-regulation, you know this, but I want to remind you of all this. Redeployment of troops out of Iraq into Afghanistan. He passed 243 new laws in 2 years, many of them quite consequential, many of them forgotten because there were so many of them that passed. In the lame duck, he had a major compromise, 2 more years of the Bush tax cuts, other tax cuts, but he extended jobless benefits, and it deepened the deficit seriously. And the one thing that he didn't really brag enough about, talk enough about, was the ratification of the New START Treaty, which is very significant in my opinion, and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the FDA reauthorization and modernization of the Food Safety Act. So if you look at how he did in that first 2 years, I don't know if you can see this, but let me just say that he set a record for presidential support scores as measured by Congressional Quarterly. In the Senate, he had a 98.7% score, House 94.4% score. You can criticize the way those are scored, but you cannot criticize the fact that they're measured in the same way, and he was higher than any president. He's probably dropped down to 10%. Clinton dropped down to 38% after he had about an 87% presidential support score after he lost the House and the Senate in the '94 election. So if you look at the controversial aspects of his presidency, something that's not discussed very often, but let's face it, it is controversial to some Americans, and that is he's the first African-American president, African-American to be president. The right thinks he's too expansionistic, activist. He's even a socialist, too radical. The left is calling him too moderate, conciliatory, too willing to sell out his base supporters. The progressives are upset with him. And the no-drama, deliberative style was too indecisive, and I call him the professorial president. Steve will have more to say about that later. In terms of controversy, as lingering high unemployment, as we know, a slow GDP growth, record deficits and debt, deadlock over deficits and debt with the Congress, and a series of crises with Congress over that, immigration reform failure, failure of climate change legislation, and a somewhat controversial anti-terrorism policy. And with that, the purpose of all of this is to remind you of what he's done, and with that we'll go to the other speakers, and then I have a few more concluding remarks about the book.
Thank you, Jim. Let me just introduce our first speaker will be Stephen Wayne, who's a professor of American government at Georgetown University. He's author of several books. The most recent is his edition of Personality and Politics, subtitled Obama For and Against Himself. And his chapter in this book is similarly titled Obama's Personality and Performance. You can either speak from the table or from the podium. It's your choice.
Look at the picture of Barack Obama on the cover of this book. Seems to me it makes him look haughty, overly confident, somewhat aloof, cold, with his head held a little bit too high. Unfortunately, I think it also captures the personality dimensions that have dominated his behavior as president, at least thus far. And, you know, to some extent, he warned us about his penchant for, or perhaps the danger of, isolation in the Oval Office. He said during the campaign that he didn't want to be encased in the White House bubble that surrounds the president. Remember, he said, "That's why I want my BlackBerry." Secret Service said, "No, they can pinpoint your location." The archivist said, "No, all the email has to be part of the archives." Eventually, he kept it, and I think 23 people, if I recall correctly, have the number on the BlackBerry. That's why he reads 10 letters and emails a day that are picked by his correspondence staff as to be representative of the mail that's coming in, and why, in some cases, he responds to a few of them cryptically himself. Yet, to me, he seems happily snug in the protective custody of the White House, both at home and when he travels abroad. His seems to me, at least, to be an overly programmed presidency. A powerful and an elegant orator, he is totally dependent on the teleprompter. A rational and calculating thinker, he seems to be a very reluctant doer, very risk-averse, very non-emotive. The one exception, I think, was health care. The only issue which I believe, other than his election, he personalized so far that he's been in the White House. Now, of course, we warn presidents not to personalize policy because they become rigid and they're not able to compromise very well. But they also go the extra mile for things that they really believe or feel that are important. And I think that's one area where Barack Obama went the extra mile. A confident decision maker, according to Bob Woodward in his book, Obama's Wars, he sought the concurrence of all his advisors on the first Afghanistan decision to raise the troop levels, 30,000 troops, before he would announce it publicly in a speech at West Point. A writer and a campaigner who's extolled the virtue and the importance of presidential policy making. He allows the executive branch and members of Congress to fill in most of the substantive details of that policy. A candidate who promised transformational change, he's been obsessed with compromise, much of it to the displeasure of his Democratic base, and with almost no encouragement from his Republican adversaries. And his goal of transformational leadership, which he advocated during the campaign, has been replaced by the difficulty of even transacting the country's business as president. He's been very slow, as the Washington Post pointed out, to nominating judges, has left some of his nominees wither in the Senate, even when there was just one opponent to it. He's been slow to build a policy consensus around his positions, even after they've been enacted into law. If you look at the Gallup poll, there's still a plurality that are against his health care program. He's been slow to make and slower even to sell the very hard budget decisions. It would have seemed to me, with the collapse of the super committee, that this would have been a time where the president could have gotten up and proposed something which made sense and took it to the American people and to the Congress, and if they didn't support it, run on it in the election, but he has not done that. Within the domestic arena, and to a lesser extent within the international arena, his leadership seems to be becoming increasingly inept. He seems more comfortable campaigning than he does governing. Now, it's easier to campaign than to govern. As a candidate, you promise. As a president, you have to deliver. As a candidate, you raise hopes. As a president, you have to deal with reality. As a candidate, you inspire. As a president, you have to explain. And obviously, as Jim said, a lot of the news is not good on the economic front and is very difficult to explain. But as I look at him, you know, he's on the road constantly campaigning now. He seems to enjoy, at least he wrote about this in his book, The Audacity of Hope, he seems to enjoy the adulation he receives from crowds. He seems to like announcing the successes he's had. He seems to enjoy and be very good at the joint press conferences he holds with foreign leaders. But what he doesn't enjoy and hasn't really done much about is the laborious give and take of the trench warfare in which we have to engage in dealing with Congress to achieve his policy goals. The principal compromises he has achieved have been almost totally within his own party. And I think more a consequence of the work of congressional leaders, Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, than Barack Obama. Again, the big exception here is health care. If you ask the Obama people today what the problem is, they'll point to the poisonous political environment, the very deep economic recession, the worst since the Great Depression, competing national interests on the international scene, and of course, to some extent, they of course are right. But I also think that there's been a failure of leadership at the presidential level. The president talks too much, travels too much, and acts too little. He doesn't appear to be as much in charge as we expected him to be and as he promised he would be in his 2008 campaign. He's not been the bold new thinker he wanted to be. Rather, it seems to me he's been a very risk-averse policymaker, totally inhibited by the strident partisan opposition he's faced. He doesn't direct as much as he delegates. He doesn't seem to, and I'd be interested in Barbara's comments on this, he doesn't seem to like to get his hands dirty with partisan politics. He'd rather be a philosopher king, preaching and presiding, but as we all know, that's not the way you prevail in our polity and our political system as it exists today. As the campaign has gotten underway, he sounds more and more to me like Harry Truman. But philosophy aside, it seems to me that his personal attributes resemble those of George Herbert Walker Bush, and unfortunately we know what happened to him. The irony here is that the Republicans will paint Obama as a liberal activist within the domestic arena, which I don't think he's been, with the exception of health care. At least he hasn't been successfully. And they'll probably paint him as unassertive and deferential in foreign affairs, which to some extent he has been, but which we've learned is probably not nearly as dangerous, as harmful as the other kind of behavior, lesson, that we learned from the Bush administration. Now, in the end, President Obama's personality may not matter. It may be conditions and the perceptions of those conditions that dictate or determine the outcome of the election. But it may be a close election. And if it is a close election, it seems to me that perceptions of Obama himself will matter. They will make a difference. And I don't think he's helped himself in his presidency so far in projecting the personality dimensions that he wanted to project and that he said he would project as a candidate.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Let's move on to Barbara Sinclair, who is a professor emeritus at the University of California in Los Angeles. Barbara is the author of some very popular award-winning books on such topics as congressional leadership, the Senate, the role of process and procedures in Congress. My favorite of her books is entitled Unorthodox Lawmaking, New Legislative Processes in the U.S., which explains all the ways of skinning a cat on Capitol Hill. And I will not extend that metaphor to sausage making. Barbara's chapter in this book is titled Congressional Leadership in Obama's First 2 Years. Barbara?
We can see the story of Obama and the Democratic Congress in 2009, 2010. Sorry. I moved it out of the way so that it wouldn't be right in my face, but maybe I need it there. Yeah.
Maybe we should just lower it.
Okay. We can see that, and 2009, 2010, the 111th Congress, as a story of policy success and political failure. Now, usually analyses of failure are more revealing, but actually I'm going to concentrate on the success because I think that holds more important lessons for what's going on now and for the future. Now, I want to remind you of just how much really important legislation was enacted. Jim brought up some of the things, and of course everybody always talks about the stimulus, healthcare reform, and the financial services regulation, Dodd-Frank. But there's a whole lot of other stuff, and a number of things that Jim didn't, in fact, mention. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, a major change in the student loan program that freed up a lot more money for loans. I think Jim did mention the food safety legislation, child nutrition legislation, credit card regulation bill, legislation to allow the FDA to regulate tobacco, an expansion of the hate crimes that are covered by federal law, repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then the ratification by the Senate of the New START Treaty. My chapter looks at the opportunities and the challenges confronting the Democratic congressional leaders and Obama in the 111 and how they dealt with them. But we were told to try to keep our comments down to 10 minutes. So here I'm going to focus on how the 111th experience illuminates what's happening in the current Congress and what's likely to happen in the near future. And to do that, I'm going to talk about the reasons for the successes and the problems that the Congress and Obama, the Democratic Congress and Obama ran into. Well, what about reasons for successes? Certainly, very important were the big Democratic margins in both chambers. But by itself, that's not enough. The 95th Congress, I'm sure everybody remembers that very well, or has read about it. That happens to have been Jimmy Carter's first Congress. Bigger margins, nobody can tell you what that Congress did. What was important that going with the big margins was that for the Democratic Party and by U.S. standards, the party was unusually ideologically homogeneous, meaning that there was considerable shared agreement among Democratic members and within the party more generally, including Obama, both on an agenda and on sort of the general thrust of the approach to the issues on the agenda. There was at least some sense of mandate, and there was strong, capable congressional party leadership, and in the House particularly, congressional leadership, party leadership with considerable control over the process. On the other hand, there were some problems. One, Senate rules and how they are routinely used now. Most of the Democrats and Obama's agenda items had to overcome filibuster problems. Those that failed did so in good part because of filibuster problems. Almost everything had to get 60 votes. Second, if we talk about the Democratic Party being unusually united for the Democratic Party, the Republicans were also really united. Looking at it in terms of what we usually think of as kind of modern history, post-World War II, say, it's really, really remarkable how unified the Republicans were after the kind of clobbering they got in 2006 and 2008 elections. And I think that, or I would argue that reflects both a substantial, sincere policy agreement within the party in opposition to the Democratic agenda, and also agreement that all-out opposition was the best electoral strategy. And that developed really before the Congress actually met. Now, to implement that strategy, you have to remember that's dependent on an activist base that was willing to support that kind of strategy. And in fact, the activist base in the Republican Party didn't just support it, they egged the members on in that sense. Perhaps the best indicator is the Arlen Specter case. That really tells you a lot about the GOP base. After he voted for the stimulus bill, Specter couldn't possibly win a GOP primary, period. I mean, as far as being, he was a dead man walking in terms of being a Republican. So why this is important is it points out that the partisan polarization is not just a Washington phenomenon, as sometimes the media tends to portray it. It's at least as great among activists as it is among members of Congress, and it's significant, though not at the same level, among ordinary voters. Well, these two problems made enacting major legislation extremely difficult, even given all these highly conducive circumstances. You could argue that the 111th, the kind of circumstances that I brought out, are the sort of thing that doesn't happen more than every 30 years. But even given that, it was extraordinarily hard to pass a number of these things. Healthcare is kind of the poster child. Remember, it was on the Senate floor for 25 days in late 2009. The Democrats had to win 5 cloture votes. And there were less dramatic versions of the same thing on most major pieces of legislation. People talk about why didn't Obama push harder, force votes on, say, a lot of the appointments. Well, the answer is even the president cannot produce more than 24 hours in a day and a certain number of days in the year, et cetera. So, and of course, the fact that you needed 60 votes for everything meant that a lot of compromise had to be made. I mean, in some cases, compromises to get a few Republican votes, as with the stimulus. In other cases, compromises with people like Ben Nelson to get every one of the Democrats. But these compromises didn't earn the bills the mantle of bipartisanship, of reasonableness, of anything of that sort. And so I think the lessons or the warnings really are not about strategy. We can talk later if we want to about what mistakes may or may not the congressional leaders and Obama have made. But I think that the lessons really are about our government system more fundamentally. Given the level and the bases of partisan polarization, divided government is now a disaster if real policy decisions need to be made. It is not like the old days, even the old days of the 1990s, and certainly not like the pre-1980 period, where sometimes you did get significant bipartisan deals and people could argue, well, for certain kinds of decisions, divided government's actually more likely to produce things. That is not the way things are anymore. What has gone on this year was predictable, not perhaps in all of its gory details, but certainly predictable. A lot of us did predict that it would be extraordinarily hard to get anything at all done, even the ordinary sort of work of government. The second point is the Senate now is very near true gridlock. Senate rules and high partisan polarization are an absolutely unworkable combination unless the majority party's margin is very large, bigger than anything we're likely to see anytime soon. So if there is not a real decision by voters in 2012, and the voters have been kind of disinclined to make the big decision, or have it stick at least, I think we are in for a time of sound and fury producing nothing.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Our next speaker is going to be Ron Elving, who is the senior editor, Washington editor for National Public Radio, but he has also previously been a political reporter for USA Today and for Congressional Quarterly, so he's got a great deal of journalism experience in covering Congress and politics. His chapter is entitled Fall of the Favorite, which looks at Obama and the media. Ron?
Thank you. Well, as the one media representative here, I would love to be giving you a multimedia, multi-part, multi-platform, multi-dimensional presentation. But not having the capability of doing that, I thought I would at least stand up and vary the program just to that degree. The chapter is about what role the media played in the sorrows, if you will, the successes and sorrows of the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And I suppose you would have to say to begin that the real success and failure of this presidency, both in the first months, the first years, and wherever it goes from here, is not, strictly speaking, a media phenomenon. It is a reality phenomenon, but it plays as a media story on TV. It's like those old commercials about somebody saying, I'm not really a doctor, but I play one on TV, and I'm about to tell you what kind of drugs to take. This is a little bit the way we perceive the realities of any presidency. We do not have the time and the resources to do the kind of research that produces the kind of papers that the professors are able to share with us today. We don't have that time, we don't have that resource, and we can't pull all of that together. So what we see is what happens when we flip on our television, or when we flip on increasingly our computers to watch television on our computers, and to see those kinds of representation of reality that we get through the news media. The world, thereby, is not the real world, it is the world as perceived, as given us through these lenses. Now, what does that mean? Some of you may have heard me say this fairly recently, you congressional fellows, but what that means is that we are not seeing true facts, true experience, we're seeing a story. The media translate everything through the structure and the dynamics of storytelling. Narrative becomes what we learn. So, there has never been a better media narrative than the Obama campaign of 2007 and 2008. As we watch the unfolding of the current nominating procedure in the Republican Party, and we had two parties participating 4 years ago, but the one that was most compelling 4 years ago was this extraordinary story of the first African-American president rising to the nomination in competition with the first front-running woman candidate in either party. And in that enormous competition between the two of them, we had shaped a big Democratic victory, the first Democratic victory with an actual majority of the vote since LBJ, I believe, on the Democratic side. And in that narrative, of course, the media were entirely caught up, entirely fascinated, entirely participatory. So we've had candidates who were media favorites before. I mean, Bruce Babbitt was a media favorite back in the 1980s. We had Paul Tsongas. We had John Anderson in 1980. But this was an entirely different kind of media favorite. This wasn't just a question of somebody we thought was kind of cute and saying things that others couldn't say and a truth teller because he wasn't going to win. This was someone who was actually competing to win and whose story was unlike any we had ever told before. He was the bootstrapper to end all bootstrappers. And the contrast between his personality, as so well already described by Professor Wayne, and the personality of his predecessor, George W. Bush, could not have provided a higher and more dramatic kind of narrative contrast. That, of course, was carried on in the contrast with the McCain-Palin ticket in the fall of 2008. So all of this comes crashing to a halt at the apogee, if you will, of the Obama narrative, which is when he wins that election, a 2-to-1 victory in the Electoral College in November of just 3 years ago, and becomes President of the United States. And from that moment in Grant Park, when he gathered all the people together in Chicago for that celebration, until he actually started setting up his transition, everything changed. Everything in the world of perception changed. And we went from the candidate rising to the person trying to take over and translate the enormously appealing concept of change as a campaign promise into the much more problematic and difficult experience of change as real policy. And it began almost immediately, as we go into in the book, with the problems that arose in the transition in terms of appointments and the lobbyists, and are they going to exclude them or aren't them, and all the problems with Blagojevich back in Illinois selling the president's Senate seat, in the free market, and so on. I mean, everything seemed to go sour almost overnight. And in this transition shift, we had portents of what was going to come. The president and his retinue, of course, had strategies for how they were going to try to deal with this transition from campaign into governance. They had strategies and they had personalities that had been highly successful throughout the campaign. But partly because they had been so successful and because the Obama candidacy was perceived as having been, if you will, referee-aided, and to use a little football or basketball analogy, a campaign that succeeded in large part because it was so favored by the media. Because of all of that, all of the dynamic between the president and his retainers and those media people was going to reverse itself, a polarity shift, if you will, as soon as he became the actual president. And so his strategies for exposure and his strategies for controlling the narrative simply didn't work the same way and didn't really work entirely throughout the first months and years of his presidency. That then, combined with the administration's steady loss of its connection to the electorate in terms of input, they weren't getting the same kind of input from the people they were trying to govern as they got from the people who they were trying to get to vote for them, combined meant they were losing their connection to those same people in terms of getting their own message out. And polling, as poor as polling may be as a tool, as limited as it may be, and as sometimes deceptive as it may be in its uses, polling was giving them signals from very early on that that connection had been lost, and that the exact things that they thought they had been promising to people when they were candidates and delivering to people while they were in office, and in many of these cases, the very legislation they had promised was being enacted by Congress in that first 2 years, that message was not being communicated as success, and what was coming back was feedback of failure from the electorate. Now, the biggest reason that they lost control of the narrative was a news story arose. And if there's anything we know about the American news media, and I don't think that we are unique in this, in the world media, is that we have an absolute case of attention deficit syndrome. We are simply distracted by everything, constantly and sequentially, so that whatever the new bright, shiny object may be, it scarcely even needs to move to distract our attention. And if there is anything that is at all compelling to us and different from anything we've seen before, that is going to occupy our attention. And that is what happened very early on in the Obama administration. It began with resistance on the right. This was a highly compelling narrative to see, for example, the first stirrings of the Tea Party. And it began to a large degree in the conservative media. Fox News was fascinated with the very first small rallies and even helped organize some of the first rallies of the Tea Party. And, of course, we had Glenn Beck and a number of other personalities. You still remember Glenn Beck, don't you? I mean, he was a big deal not very long ago. He just came out and made a presidential endorsement today, and that made some newscasts. Glenn Beck and a number of other people who are not necessarily still on television were very excited about the issue of the president's birth certificate and the country of his birth and so forth, and that actually became an issue largely driven through the conservative media. But there were real consequences almost immediately of this attention on the Tea Party, and the Tea Party grew, and it became, of course, the town halls of August of 2009. And these real consequences fed back into Washington through the kind of messaging that came back with Charlie Grassley and everybody else who went home during that period of time to talk about the health care legislation under consideration and came back and said, I don't think that I can go on dealing with the Democrats that I've been trying to compromise with. The people back home just aren't going to have it. Now, the Obama administration tried to react to all this, tried to have an approach that would deal with the resistance they were meeting on the right. They tried to go over the heads of the media, much as other presidents have done in the past, tried to have direct contact with local media, tried to go to the local anchor person, tried to get around the people who sit in the White House and try to report what goes on in the White House in the correspondence fashion, the traditional correspondence fashion. They tried to get away from that dynamic that's been so troubling for many presidents in the past. And they tried new things through the social media, through the new media, through all the different ways that people now communicate with each other, Facebook, Twitter, that have become almost during the very months of the Obama administration, the cutting edge of people's political interaction. They tried, they had some degree of success, but they couldn't bend the curve. They couldn't change the rise of the new narrative. And at the same time that they were trying to deal with that resistance from the right, they found themselves increasingly beset by pushback from the left. By all the Glenn Greenwalds of the world, by all the people at Fire Dog Lake, by all the people who were writing things on the internet, blogging, criticizing the Obama administration from the 180-degree opposite perspective from the one they were trying to deal with in the main. So for many, the failure to close Guantanamo Bay Prison was the biggest issue of the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And the failure to address immigration and the failure to address climate change, these were the biggest stories by far. Finally, in the fall of 2010, all these things came together. The Democratic voting base was only a shadow of what it had been in 2008. The Republicans, on the other hand, saw a fantastic turnout in their base. And the administration, even in the weeks leading up to the shellacking, famously described by the president himself, saw it all, analyzed it all, was highly self-aware, and revealing of exactly how they saw it in interviews that they gave to Rolling Stone and New York Times, 60 Minutes, and so forth, some of which were before, some of which were after the actual voting in November, but all of which had exactly the same tone and content. Bloomberg News did a poll in October of 2010 that found that by 2-to-1 margins, Americans believed that the economy had shrunk throughout the Obama administration's time in office, despite 15 months of consecutive expansion in the economy. They believed taxes had gone up sharply, despite the fact that taxes had, in fact, gone down, largely because of the tax cuts included in the stimulus package, which were almost secret tax cuts, as the Obama White House itself would admit. And they also believed that all the money that had gone out in TARP to the banks had been totally lost, despite the fact that most of that money was in the process of being recovered. The comment that the pollster who did that particular poll said It does not do you any good to make change if you cannot communicate change. And that was ultimately what the Obama White House was unable to do. They were fantastic at selling change as a concept, when it was popular as a campaign promise, when people could imagine that change being whatever kind of change they thought they might want. They were not so good at maintaining the connection and controlling the narrative once the change in reality became substantive, and people had to bite down on that and decide whether or not they liked it. That was the first 2 years of the Obama administration. I think it's probably fair to say it has characterized the third year as well. And as they shift entirely into campaign mode over the next 12 months, we'll see if the ability that they had to sell campaign promises of change and positivity will overcome what the drawbacks have been in their ability to control and direct the narrative in the time since then. They will, of course, in the next 12 months have the advantage of having another team on the field that they can play instead of simply themselves.
Thank you. We will now hear from Scott Lilly, who is now a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress. But before that, he spent 31 years on the Hill as a staff person, and I was pleased to know him for many of those years. Among other things, he was staff director of the Appropriations Committee, and before that, staff director with the Democratic Study Group and on the Joint Economic Committee staff. And best of all, he spent many of those years with David Obey, who has always been one of my favorite members of Congress from my neighboring state of Wisconsin. I'm from Illinois, but I got to know him pretty well over those years. But Scott, we're pleased to have you. And your chapter, I believe, is entitled Communication as Destiny. I was wondering whether you were tempted, after I had read it, to call it that line from HUD. What we have here is a failure to communicate. But anyway, Scott, you may carry on.
I actually used that. Well, Jeff Biggs called me about a little over a year ago and said, I want you to come and talk to the APSA fellows. And I said, okay. And he said, and I guess I should tell you, I wanted you to come the morning after the election, which was... So I was standing in the hallway at SICE waiting for the auditorium to open up, and Obama was having his press conference, and he said, I would not recommend to any future president that he take a shellacking like I took last night. And I started thinking about why did this happen? What an incredible change of fate in a short period of time, and particularly sort of thinking about the 2008 election in the context that many people talked about it at the time as compared to Roosevelt's election in 1932. The country was in similar crises. There were similarities between Obama's platform and program and Roosevelt's. So I decided I'd just look at where they were comparable and where they weren't. What problems did each of the two men have, and why did they have such different outcomes? And I think the first thing, and very important, is Obama's timing was really bad. Roosevelt became president in March of 1933. That was 3.5 years after the stock market had failed. It was unemployment was at 3.2% in October of 1929, and it fell almost constantly for 3.5 years. And it even fell between the time he was elected and the time he took office in March, when it hit 25.3%, and that was the absolute bottom of the Depression, the day that he was sworn in. So the focus was on the failure of the economy at the time he took office. That was really the only focus people had, and there was no place to go but up from there. Obama was a very different situation. When he took office in January of 2009, we had just at that point really gone into free fall. And if you go back and look at the blue chip forecasts, you find that every month from July until December of 2008, the blue chip forecast for GDP dropped, and the forecast for unemployment went up. So it was just a steady realization, greater and greater realization. There were a few people like Jan Hutzius at Goldman Sachs who saw from the early in the fall of 2008 that this was a really bad economic situation, and that we were down the tubes. But most of the blue chip forecasters continued to raise their estimate of unemployment through January, February, March, April. There was an increasing awareness as the administration went on that we were in a terrible difficulty, and that made it hard to keep the focus and to make people realize that your program was working. The second thing, and I think it's already been mentioned by several people, but Obama had a lot of different issues that he felt like he had to deal with. Roosevelt was really sort of blessed by the fact that the economy overshadowed everything, and it was apparent to everybody that the economy was the only issue. But Obama had two wars going on. He had very strong demands from the environmental community about global warming and other problems. He had a commitment that he and his party had fought for decades to do something about health care. He had a major portion of his party who was very interested in changing the rules on sexual orientation. He had demands for immigration from an important constituency that had turned out big. So there were a lot of different demands, and it was an environment that it made it hard to keep on message and on the thing that most people were concerned about. The third problem that he had was a virulent opposition. Throughout the 20th century, we have had a tradition where opposition political parties, particularly in the wake of a successful presidential campaign, lay low for a period of time. And Roosevelt had an opposition that was described by some observers at the time as being supine. The chairman of the Republican National Committee called his party members in Congress, or the Republicans in Congress, full of rubber stamps and feeble minds. They really mostly just voted for the New Deal out of unawareness of what else they might do. But that was anything but the posture of the Republicans in Congress. And they were able to maintain a united front, and they hit hard, and they hit often, and they hit early. He got no Republican votes in the House for his first major piece of legislation, which was the stimulus package. And they continued to hammer him on that issue day and night from then on. And I think the fourth big factor here is a hostile press. Barack Obama is really the first president that had to deal with an institution like Fox News. Fox was only created 15 years ago. It's hard for me to believe that it's that recent. And for the first several years, it only had 20% of cable subscribers could even get Fox. But it has become an amazing institution. And I think there was a recent poll that showed that cable news is by far the biggest source of information for voters in the 2010 elections. 81% said they got news from cable news, only 71% from broadcast news, and something like 60% from newspapers. So cable news is the big thing. And among those who got information from cable news, 42% said they watched Fox, compared with 30% CNN and 12% MSNBC. So it was a dominant force, and as Ron also pointed out, it was an information network for political activists who were opposing the Obama administration. 40% of Republicans now watch Fox News on a regular basis, which is a fairly astounding figure. It is sometimes underestimated because there are rarely more than 1 or 2 million people watching Fox News, as compared to maybe 7 million watching the evening broadcast newscast. But over the course of the day, it reaches far more people than all of the networks combined. But as Don said, if you go through all of that, it's very hard to understand, despite the size of those hindrances. They do not explain the drubbing that the Democrats took on Election Day, and that's measured in terms of massive losses in the House. I think they lost 54 out of 258 seats they had. 25% of the seats the Democrats held in the House they lost. They lost 30 of the 19 Senate, 30% of the Senate seats that were up. And they got really killed in the state legislatures. Republicans now hold more seats in state legislatures than at any time since 1928. So the whole legacy of the New Deal and the realignment of the American electorate that followed that has shifted back based on what happened in that election. And I think you can't really explain that except in the words of the warden in Cool Hand Luke. What we have here is a failure to communicate. And I think the failure was really profound. And I've got my notes mixed up here, so I need to. What happened with the communication policy of the administration, I think, is a real mystery, because the president is clearly one of the most articulate men to have held the office of president in the history of the country. But he was clearly not focused on the issues that people were interested in. And I think, as the polling numbers that Ron mentioned point out, even members of the Democratic Party were misinformed about what had happened with the administration. A majority of Democrats, I think 58 to 26%, thought that their taxes had gone up and that middle-class taxes had gone up, even though they'd gone down. So it wasn't just Fox News; it was a general misperception and inability to communicate accurately with even with his own people. And I've used one example in this paper, which I think was a real turning point in the administration, and that was on July 1 of 2009. There was a Gallup poll that showed that Obama had 61% approval rating, which was pretty close to what he had in January. I mean, he'd bumped up and down a little bit, but he had held pretty steady for the first 5 months. On July 2nd, the Labor Department reported that we had lost 457,000 jobs, and there was a brief statement by the president in the Rose Garden late that afternoon. But most of the effort at the White House was preparing the president and the press corps to go to Russia, Italy, and Ghana on a 9-day trip. That brief statement in the Rose Garden was the last thing he said for 9 days. There were 18 White House press releases. There were 40 special briefing reports. There was not one comment about unemployment during that period. At the same time, John Boehner was having press conferences all over the country. He released a videotape with a pair of bloodhounds that were looking for the jobs created in the stimulus package. And the entire Republican conference had gone home to talk to people in their districts and pound the president on lack of interest in jobs, lack of focus on the economy. When the White House finally did, 10 days later, make mention of unemployment again, it was in the Saturday radio address, but unfortunately that was broadcast from Ghana, which did not make it a very convincing address that he was focused on the economy. By the end of July, his approval ratings had dropped to 54%, and they have never been above 55% since then. So it really was a turning point, and I think it was compounded by many of the other fights that he had and the speeches that he made. Stephen talked about all the things that he talks about. Said he travels too much and he talks too much, and I think that's is very true. And when he uses the words like green jobs, infrastructure bank, and he thinks he's talking about jobs, but much of the polling that's been done shows that the words that he likes to use are not words that average people, particularly those suffering from the most unemployment, tend to relate to. And so I would say there was a huge problem with communication in the first 2 years, and I regret to say that I don't see that improving very much.
Thank you very much, Scott. I've asked Jim to say a few additional words about some of the things that we haven't covered, but also sort of help lead us into a further discussion.
Right. I think context matters, and everybody has had that theme. And the context in the polling numbers by Jacobson and Boyd in the first two chapters are important, and that is that they found that there was little consensus about what the problems were, what the threats were with respect to jobs, debt and deficit, health care, education, Afghanistan, Middle East, and little consensus about solutions. And they, Jacobson in particular, put Obama and his positions, he plotted them in terms of public attitudes, and he was perceived to be much further to the left than the American public. I think that context makes a big difference. We have also the context that Barbara talked about of divided party government is now a disaster. We have historically high party unity scores. The parties are very homogeneous in terms of the way they vote, but we also have a lot of interest groups that disagree with each other, disagree about what the problems are and the solutions, and we have deadlock. We have the continued realignment of the South. That's one of the stories, I think, out of 2010. Lost a lot of blue dogs, went from 52 to 26, and they were replaced by some very conservative people. We have limits on resources, large debt and deficit. We have a president that several of you have said is risk averse. Some have said that he should have taken the commission on debt and deficit solutions early, run with them, and taken a risk with that. That continued through the CRs, the continuing resolutions, and the crisis over the debt limit and the super committee. The question I have for the panel is, yes, he's risk averse, but is he a guy who leads from behind? If you even look at the health care package, he waited for it to develop in the House of Representatives. It was much too liberal for the Senate. He let the Senate develop two bills, one out of HELP, one out of the Finance Committee, and Baucus became Hamlet. And after about 3 months, he finally intervened at that point to push for a decision. I think that he maybe overlearned, and maybe some of his staff overlearned the lessons of 1994 when the Clinton White House really didn't coordinate their activities and bring in the leadership, meaning the chairs of the House of Representatives and the leader of the Tom Foley, the leader of the House, with respect to health care reform. He certainly showed that with Chairman Waxman when Waxman went ahead with cap and trade, speaking about jargon. I mean, what is cap and trade? We all know what cap and trade is, but they don't know what it is in Iowa. He went with cap and trade first, then health care, using up a whole lot of time and support for the institution. I think he leads from behind domestically. There's a different picture internationally, and I'd like to open up this question to the panelists.
May I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Because, I mean, Jim, you are a congressional scholar.
Yes.
You should not be talking about he let the Senate, he let the House. Come on, the president cannot dictate. And, you know, the president does not pass bills. The Congress does.
Right. My point is that he didn't jump in and really push it hard. He had a hands-off approach, especially with respect to Waxman in the House. Yes, we have a separated system. I understand that.
Yes.
And I like Congress better than the presidency, but that's...
well, and they're so much more fun to study, really, because there are more of them. I mean, that's the trouble with the president. You know, that N of one is just a real pain.
But the point is that he really did stay out of the fray.
Well, look, one of the reasons that he could, in fact, not act in as heavy-handed a fashion as the Clinton people tried to and didn't manage to succeed with, is because you had a relatively unified Democratic Party. Now, that does not mean, obviously, that they were monolithic. But, you know, ask yourself, okay, with health care, yes, it would have been a very good thing if Baucus had moved earlier. Now, what could Obama have really done? Because remember, you needed what ended up being a Baucus that was completely committed to this bill to get it through.
Well, before even that, I mentioned this briefly, I would have strongly encouraged the leadership in the House not go forward with climate change first.
Right.
That probably...
He wasted a lot of resources.
I would say, actually, that was probably Pelosi more than Waxman.
I think it was.
I agree. I think...
but that was probably a mistake.
I think it was a huge mistake to go with cap and trade. I think if the Speaker tells the President that that's what she's going to do, that's pretty much what would happen, you know. And she had really pulled off some miracles that he needed to be pretty grateful for. Nonetheless, I think they should have weighed in harder. The White House should have weighed in harder and cautioned against the climate change. They would have certainly taken some lumps from the environmental group had they done so. I mean, they couldn't have kept that quiet. On the health care bill and Baucus, I think that is that was also a huge mistake, and I don't think it needed to turn out that way. I don't think they spent months thinking that they were going to get Grassley support, and that was never in the cards. And anybody that I think any reasonable observer could have figured out that they weren't going to get that, and they played that game, and that's when the wheels started coming off in terms of just looking like this sausage machine that the White House had been sucked into. But I would say also in terms of this, does he lead from behind? He certainly does not lead from behind inside the White House. I mean, I would say to a fault, is very directional and authoritative and does not tolerate a lot of criticism or dissent.
Let me ask you a question. Would
Barbara,
it
use the
be-
microphone there.
May I ask,
Yes.
would it have been possible to persuade Baucus earlier that there was no way he was going to get Grassley?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that clearly was one of the dynamics, is that Baucus is afraid to go out to the Senate floor without people, and he knew that it would be very hard to get it. But I think that part of the problem is the guy in the White House who was managing this was a former Baucus staff guy. And,
Messina.
right. And so I think that caused this thing to just go on and on a lot longer than it should have. But I think if they'd said to Baucus, you've got a week, at most 2 weeks, and then we're going to take it over with, and that would have been reasonable, and they should have done that.
But I think ultimately Barbara's making an important point. It makes me want to take pharmaceuticals because I love the institution, and that is the Senate is really in gridlock. I mean, to have a supermajority for a normal business and you don't have it, it's terrible, and in my opinion, and divided government now is a disaster. I read some earlier material by you when I was writing. I just finished writing something called "What's Wrong with Congress and What to Do About It," and so I was rereading your work. And you at one point said, "Well, it's the parliamentary system. Legislating is hard. This is the way it should work. It's okay." But you're taking a slightly different position right now, Barbara.
But I'm not sure that.
I just read that paragraph.
Well, you mean that it's not a parliamentary?
Well, I do promise if we have unified Republican government after the 2012 elections, we'll get back and talk about this again, because there might be some people that change their ideas on the filibuster. But in any event, what I wanted to pick up on was the lead from behind phrase, which originally I think was used by a member of the Obama National Security Council describing the U.S. role in Libya, why we let Great Britain and France take the lead on that, and then Obama did join up with the coalition and support that. Certainly, but I think a lot of people are using it in every whichever context now, and I'm not sure that necessarily fits on domestic policy. Yes, the president did allow the Congress to fill in details on a lot of the legislation, but he certainly set out his main goals, his priorities in advance, as many of you have pointed out in your chapters. But I'm wondering, I wanted to throw this to Scott, because you've been involved over the years with a lot of budgetary matters, both on appropriations and generally with budget committee work and so on. But do you think that the president is taking the right tack now on the whole approach to deficit reduction? Was he right to stay out of the last round with the super committee and not weigh in there and let them take the lead and fail as it turned out?
Well, he wanted a clean debt limit with no riders, and so he ended up with a debt limit bill that had a super committee that could not possibly succeed, and sanctions that can't possibly be imposed. So I think he ended up with a clean debt limit through a roundabout manner. I actually think they have managed their negotiations on budget matters pretty skillfully. I think it's astounding how little of what the Republicans were fighting for in the 2011 continuing resolution they actually ended up with. I mean, the White House won 95% of what his CBO scoring showed that there was virtually no deficit reduction as a result of it, and that's because the White House they got this $1,043 billion ceiling for discretionary spending for 2012. Which is way above where the Republicans were coming in originally, and I'm sort of amazed that they're able to get as far as they have. I think part of it is that Boehner realizes that he would be creating a disaster if he let his troops go as far as they want to go, and he's happy to try to compromise. But they're winning an awful lot in these negotiations.
So is Obama also correct in staying away or walking away from his own commission on deficit reduction, Simpson-Bowles?
Well, I don't think there's, I don't think there's any way you could get the votes in Congress to pass Simpson-Bowles. So,
He was best
it doesn't
staying out of that.
and I certainly think he was smart to stay away from the super committee. I mean, that, I don't know any, I think there are 12 members of Congress that wish they'd never heard of the super committee right now.
Anybody else on the panel want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think about Lee Hamilton's quote, and you probably remember it, and he said the budget process is exhibit A of congressional failure. That, we've changed it every few years in terms of the rules. We continue to change it. And they have rules now that they can't abide by, and they're going forward without any closure on the debt and the deficit. Pay-go, pay-as-you-go. Some people think this is a good thing. It's only on the spending side, not the revenue side. I think that the budget process is in shambles, personally, and that's related to this whole negotiation.
Okay. Anybody else? Barbara?
Well, just, the process cannot trump the kind of polarization we have. You're just not going to be able to figure out a clever way of getting people who, among other things, truly, honestly, have extremely different notions about what is good public policy. I mean, yes, sure, there are lots of political games in there too, but there is a real divide, and there are just not many things that both sides would see as better than the status quo.
Does everyone agree then with the conventional wisdom that we won't get any movement on much of anything until after the 2012 election somehow sort things out?
If then.
I don't know if we'll get movement after 2012.
Right.
It'll be deadlock.
Stephen?
So good luck, congressional fellows.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that, but the problem lead by following is a contradiction in terms. And as far as the perception of the presidency, we want in bad times the president to seem like he's in charge and to seem like he takes the bull by the horns rather than follows the bull around. And I think we've talked about losing control of the narrative and the press story and all of that. And certainly President Obama would look much better if economic conditions were better. And we wouldn't be debating all of this. But my problem with President Obama is he's too multi-focused. He's all over the place. And he doesn't seem to be assertive enough. He waits rather than he says, yes, we need to do something in energy, we need to do something on the environment, we need to do something in healthcare, but he doesn't define the something sufficiently enough that he can get credit for it when something is passed, if something is passed.
I'd like to ask Steve
Sure.
a question about personality. Some people have said that his training as a community organizer and the way he was raised has created a personality that listens to people, and that community organizers certainly do that, and they wait to find out what the problems are, and then they help facilitate building leadership in a community to go ahead on housing, healthcare, education, public safety, whatever. Do you think he listens too much?
Well, no, I don't think he listens too much, but I think he's obsessed by being a conciliator. He's obsessed by being a compromiser. He wants to, how did he rationalize his identity problem? First of all, he didn't know, he says, in Dreams from My Father, I don't know who the hell I was. So then he palled up with, in high school and a little bit at Occidental, young African-American males primarily. And then he goes into an environment at Columbia where he basically becomes an intellectual hermit and stays by himself. Then later on, he becomes the organizer. That doesn't work. He goes back to school. So how do you reconcile all the different groups you've been a part of and have very skillfully adapted yourself to that group? Don't look at the differences. Look at what we have in common. So it's this common sense, common purpose that drives him. And as everybody has said, that in our society right now, the differences stand out and the commonalities are very, very difficult to see. So I don't think it's a problem of listening. I think it's a problem of trying to be everything to everybody rather than asserting themselves.
There's one other piece in the education puzzle that I find fascinating, and it's in all the biographies, and particularly in the Bridge. That's the Harvard Law School experience when he was, long before he was first African-American president of the United States, he was the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review. And in that job, which was perceived as being a kind of ringmaster job because there were a lot of people, extraordinarily strong personalities in the Harvard Law School who wanted to be in the competitive position of being on the law review. This was the way you show your bona fides, the way you make your way onto a Supreme Court clerkship, the way you get on the fastest of all tracks in the legal profession. And in the midst of all of those contesting egos, his approach was, again, to try to listen to everybody, to surprise everyone with his reasonableness, to attempt to get people who were trying to be the next Scalia to agree with people who were really hoping that they could be more like William Brennan, who could take the court in a totally different direction, and to try to compose all of them as though he were the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court or some other conciliator of a personality. That is an absolutely terrible media narrative. That just doesn't work if you're trying to communicate your agenda or you're trying to push your ideas in the world of the media. It might be fantastic on the Harvard Law Review, and there were a number of people who thought it was brilliant at that time. But it doesn't really matter where you lead the Harvard Law Review. There'll be somebody else the next year. The presidency of the United States is an entirely different situation, and in that situation, for him to revert to that part of his personality as opposed to the much more hortatory and leading kind of idea person that he was in the campaign context of 2007 and 2008 was, I think, a big part of the negative shift in terms of the capabilities of the Obama people in the White House.
Barbara, in your books, you indicate that in Congress, personality and character, leadership style don't matter all that much because the leaders are really the agents of their caucuses. Is that the same with a president, or does character, personality, leadership style matter more there?
Well, for one thing, I'd think that because the president is singular, we perhaps tend to overanalyze and attribute an awful lot to personality, character, etc. I don't think we have emphasized enough here the fact that the economy is lousy. Sure, the Obama folks made a mistake by their projection, but of a max of 8% unemployment. But on the other hand, that was really a very broad consensus at the time that projection came out, but by and large, it is very, very hard to communicate well enough to persuade people when the economy is as bad as it's been and continues to be, that things are hunky-dory. And I think Obama's chance here is that he's running against somebody. And who knows whom at this point, but he will be running against an alternative, and that especially if it's someone that either is or has been pushed very, very far to the right, that might, in fact, make a difference. But as Scott was saying, and as other people have also pointed out, the timing for Obama was really very difficult. Not for us, but for Obama, it would have been better for him if the election had been a year later, and things had been so clearly terrible when he came in. This way, we were sliding off a cliff, and I just don't see how changes in communication strategy or leadership style or focus would have made that much difference. I mean, some sure, but not appreciable would be my.
I have to say, I mean, if you go back to this comparison with Roosevelt, I mean, people forget that in 1936, when I'm sorry, in 1934, in his first midterm, he picked up 9 Republican House seats, and he picked up seats in the Senate, and he picked up governorships, and unemployment was still at 21%. So he had, well, but it hadn't, you know, I mean, it was still 21% unemployment, and there was a great deal of frustration and fear, but he was able to focus on it and convince people that he was doing everything that could be done, whereas even though Obama has done many of the right things, he has not had a consistent communication policy that conveyed that, as the polling data that Ron used clearly shows.
A lot of people have made the point that had Obama not done what he did on stimulus, and some question how many jobs were created or saved or whatever, but that things certainly would have gotten much worse. We could have really slid into another depression. But others say, well, yeah, but it's hard to run on a counterfactual when you're running for re-election that it could have been worse. So that's not exactly the best campaign slogan that you can go into an election with. But in any event, I think that's a point that Barbara was making as well. Let's,
go
ahead.
I think, Barbara, you're absolutely right. Obama ran for the first, in the public opinion, Obama ran for the first 2 years against the image he projected of himself during the campaign. And it's hard to maintain that image. Now he'll be running against, you know, a live human being who the media will take apart, as they've done almost every other week for the different Republican candidates.
It is our work.
We'll have a tremendous amount of negative advertising. It's already. So what's going to happen if the economy doesn't improve? The choice is going to be who's the least worst candidate. And that's what we're going to go into the next administration with.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think that's a good place for us to start asking the audience to ask their questions. So please raise your hand, wait for a microphone, and give your name and affiliation. Let's start with the gentleman on the aisle here.
Hi, my name is Brian Alexander. I'm a PhD student at George Mason University Political Science. Thank you for the excellent panel, and also thank you, Mr. Wolfensberger, for this great series. It's been a great learning opportunity to come to a lot of these, and we're sorry to see it go away. Simple question, probably not a simple answer, but based on the observations and your viewpoints that we've heard a little bit about today, will he win? Will we be back in for assessing the first 6 years discussion?
Well, great, Swami.
I'll jump in and say that the independents made a big difference in the last campaign, and we have to go to those battleground states. I think I'm not going to go through all of them, but my prediction is that it's too close to call. If Mitt Romney is the nominee, it's still too close to call, and you have to look at Florida yet again, and it's going to be very close in Florida. I can go through all the states as others have, but I personally think that we haven't seen Obama the campaigner yet. Even though he's on the road a lot, he talks too much. He's a very good campaigner. He won't have the mobilization that he had in 2008, but he is very good. and it looks like the money he is getting from small contributors is very solid. I don't think he'll get the $1 billion that he says he wants, but he may get close to $750 million like he did last time, and that makes a big difference. I won't go through all the states, don't worry.
Anybody else a prediction?
Well, it is a 50-state it is 50 different elections, but there are overarching things, and clearly, as we've already said, I think Scott made this point very well. The direction is everything. It's not the absolute number of unemployment, although we can all say no one's been reelected since FDR with unemployment over a certain number. That's just basically back formation, looking at what the number was. If it touches 10 as it has, and then it moves fairly consistently downward so that the direction for the latter 18 months of the administration is in the positive direction. And if there can be any case made at all that the administration has been on the right side of history in terms of putting a bottom to the fall with the stimulus package or whatever policy that they would put forward, and if they can make the case that we are on a trajectory that will return us to something like historic levels of unemployment and employment, and if that can then be related to the president's program for a second term so that he has something he can promise that is positive, that actually gets people back to the inspirational sense of Barack Obama they once had. All these are big ifs. But in that event, then possibly it doesn't matter that much who the Republicans nominate. It would probably be enough to hold off Mitt Romney because Mitt Romney is not Ronald Reagan, and he's not likely to turn into Ronald Reagan in the next year. So that would seem to me
Mitt Romney could turn into anything overnight. He has already.
But it will still be labeled Mitt Romney, and it'll be in that package.
Scott?
I find it daunting to predict whether or not the government's going to be shut down between now and Christmas. And I think there's so many factors out there. There's so many. I do not see any way that Mitt Romney gets the Republican nomination, because I think there's a clear 70% of the Republican electorate that does not want the guy, and you just can't get to the primaries.
You have to tell us who you think will.
Kane?
I think it's.
They didn't want John McCain either.
I mean, I
don't.
No.
No, I mean, I think it's. We're going to have a real crazy spring.
Well, you do find people who are actually arguing, sensible people who know what they're talking about, who are actually saying that the person who will beat Mitt Romney in the end, besides Mitt Romney, is Newt Gingrich. Now, personally, having watched Newt's rise in the 80s and his apogee in the 90s and his fall, I find it impossible to imagine him getting the nomination of a major party, let alone being elected in the fall. But there are sensible people who think that, given the set of alternatives the Republicans have confined themselves to, if they cannot accept Mitt Romney, and in the end, I suspect that in the end, they'll say this is the only guy we've got who's going to beat Obama, and they'll therefore swallow hard like they did with John McCain and make that hard choice. But a lot of people are starting to say the only guy left is Gingrich.
But wouldn't it be fun if we had an old-fashioned brokered convention?
Oh,
I'll sign up for that.
If we had a brokered convention, you'd have you would have Romney, and if you had Republican operatives here in Washington, you'd have Romney. But that's not who's making the decision. It's grassroots people out in little towns in Georgia, and I don't see them having a rational, measured view of Mitt Romney versus Barack Obama as the best matchup.
And the other thing we have to note is, the Republicans have changed their rules. And you have proportional voting until April 1st in the Republican primaries. So last time around, McCain had, I think, 38% of the vote on Super Tuesday and about 75% of the delegates. That's not going to happen this time. Right. So it will extend longer, I think.
Okay.
Marvelous.
Anyone else on that? Other questions? Let's go with Jeff here, Jeff Biggs. Take the gum out of your mouth.
Based on the polling figures and the communication strategy of the administration, why don't they take Mark Twain more seriously? The problem isn't what people don't know. It's what they know for sure that just ain't so. Now, you know, you've portrayed an administration which has got a smorgasbord of issues. And they're on one issue one day and a different issue the next day. And yet they are factually incorrectly being charged with raising taxes. They haven't focused on that. They've got an Affordable Care Act, the great benefits of which don't go into play until 2014, and yet the average American still thinks it involves death panels. Why don't they pick 2 or 3 factual things which are tarnishing them and recorrect or reorient the American public on those issues? Because they're just being beaten up and they're not defending themselves.
What you're saying is that they should have a clear strategy, theme, and message, and repeat it, repeat it, repeat it.
That would help.
And I think that he's trying to do that with jobs, the jobs bill. He's trying to do that, and in this talking and traveling lately, it's about jobs, finally, focused on jobs. And on the stimulus package, the package is very interesting. They should brag about it. 1/3 were tax cuts that the Republicans wanted. 1/3 were Medicaid payments and unemployment payments that Republican governors wanted. And the last third, half of the last third were not shovel-ready jobs. They were keeping police, first responders, and educators in their jobs. And they haven't bragged enough about that. They really, it's hard to prove a counterfactual situation, but I think they should brag about that with respect to jobs. They're not doing that.
But, you know, Obama admitted that they didn't have the shovel-ready jobs available that they thought they might, but that made it sound like a complete failure. So he did not emphasize, I guess, what was done with the money.
The other thing is, of course, the American people are very negative on government. What is it, something like 87% mistrust the government, don't think the government does what is right most or all of the time. So how are you going to project a program that involves a government initiative when people have so little faith in government? That's why I think you're right. In the first 2 years, they did do a lot of legislation. But an activist government that doesn't have results to show for it is more of a liability than it is an asset.
Okay. Let's go to Flip Strum here.
Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. 2 questions. One is, you've spoken about it being the wrong time for Obama. I wonder if you have any thoughts about, had he been a Washingtonian for too short a time, did his relative lack of experience in Washington affect his inability to perform more successfully as president? And the other thing that's been mentioned only in passing is foreign policy. And I wonder whether anybody would like to comment on to what extent the continuation of the 2 wars has affected his ability to function, and why he hasn't been able to parlay his foreign policy successes, or the dramatic ones, into more favorable public opinion. The killing of bin Laden, you can see Libya, I think, as a success. Is it because he hasn't communicated? Is it because the American public really doesn't care that much about foreign policy? What would be your reading there?
I'll take the first part of that question in terms of management experience. Before he got into the campaign, he managed 28 people in the Senate. He had very little experience managing anything, and I think there was a great deal of learning on the job, not only about management, and he learned fast, but also learning on the job with respect to defense policy and foreign policy. My opinion is that he became influenced significantly by the Defense Department in his policy, leaned heavily towards their solutions. I think that happened with Clinton also. Neither one of them had served. Neither one of them were well liked by the military. Neither one of them had a lot of support, and I think he leaned heavily that way, and he still is with respect to the use of Predator aircraft and missiles and other ways of going after terrorists. Now, with respect to your other aspects of the question, I think, Steve, you wanted to jump in, right?
I think the economy trumps everything else. I think it even trumps the wars, although we obviously are getting out of Iraq because of the status of force agreement, which was signed during the Bush administration. And he now sees that a majority of people think the war or our involvement in Afghanistan was too much and a mistake. So I think that we will pull out of that. But I think the economy, people, when they look at foreign affairs and they see Europe as a basket case, and they see some of the problems in China and the rest of the world, that we've got enough problems of our own, focus on here. I think that's the overwhelming cry of the American people. Bring us back, and let's conserve our treasury and focus on domestic problems.
That's certainly what George W. Bush learned in 1992. I mean, George H.W. Bush learned in 1992.
Let's face it, there's a low-grade recession that will go on for a very long time until the housing market cleans itself out. And we acted quickly with respect to this economy, and it worked fairly well. Europe is not. And I think that many, well, the French in particular, would like to see Europe do what we did with the central bank and also the stimulus package and our financial reform package. There's been a lot of success there, but no one's bragging about it, in my opinion. And we will have unemployment at a very high rate for a long time, in my opinion, because of the housing market.
Yeah. I'd like to respond to the first part of that question, because I think if you consider the fact that he had barely hired the staff in the Senate before he started campaigning for president, his real experience in governance was several years in the Illinois State Senate. I mean, and that's really what you're dealing with in terms of the maturity of a lot of the judgments that you see exercised at the White House on a day-to-day basis. It explains what Ron is talking about in terms of this guy that wants to be a conciliator. He wants to do, he has no model, he has no experience in dealing with the rough and tumble world of government and what you've got to push hard in order to lead or represent the interests of the people that elected you. And, I think that's, you're right on point there.
And he doesn't know them personally. They're not his friends. He's not an easy guy to get friendly with or to get, well, he's just too analytic a personality. So you have the inexperience, and then they're not knowing people. Now we have a large turnover. All those things are a recipe for disaster and for inaction.
Plus, it's been rumored that he doesn't like Congress. He doesn't like the place.
Well, let's take, for example, we've already talked about Max Baucus and Chuck Grassley, and this was a relationship that they had passed the gavel back and forth as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and he was in an absolutely pivotal position with regard to health care. And it's hard to imagine LBJ with his background. I know I'm taking an extreme example here, but it's hard to imagine LBJ waiting on the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee while he negotiated with some phantom Republican ranking member of that committee over something that might come together over a period of months. I think LBJ would have given him a day or two to talk, and then he would have said, look, I'm going to bring you both in here, and by the time you leave, there's going to be a consensus between you, or we're going to cut the guy out. I mean, it's just hard to imagine LBJ taking the approach with Max Baucus.
I think,
The world isn't the mid-'60s.
But it's not.
But I like the story. It's good.
Well, I think both Jim and Stephen have put their finger on that other aspect that stems from Flip's the first question that she raised, and that is inexperience. But it's also this disdain for politics. I mean, how are you going to have a post-partisan era when you're going to have to deal with Congress? You need to be able to do politics. And, when you have the president referring to members of Congress as having temperature IQs, that's not a very good way to get along and, to get things done. But I still haven't figured out how you can get anything done in this town if you don't engage in politics. That's what this government system is about. Politics is not dirty. It's a way of accomplishing things. We got a lot of hands. Let's try the gentleman sitting over here on the side. Over here. And then we'll get John Kingdon next.
On decision making.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Obama and his staff obviously have taken Romney very seriously. Was Herman Cain ever taken seriously in the White House? And in responding to Donald Trump, was that a sign of respect or a way of an attempt to delegitimize him? And who does Obama fear most among Republicans?
I think that the Republican debates have been terrific because we found out about these people, what they don't know, their personalities, but I think it's also a game of whack-a-mole. If you've ever been to a state fair in Oregon, they always had it whack-a-mole at the state fair, and the media loves narrative. They love to have this guy pop up, and then bam, you get a lot of facts like affairs and things, and they go down. And I think in the end it's Mitt Romney. I disagree with Scott. I don't see how anybody else beats him, even though they don't like him.
Yeah, I mean, Scott may be right, but in the White House, there's really only one guy as far as they're concerned. It's Mitt Romney, or anybody else is a laugher as far as they're concerned. I'm not sure Herman Cain ever took himself seriously as a presidential candidate.
At least until recently.
Well, he thought he was running to, burnish the brand, raise his speaking fee, and sell a lot of books, all of which was happening for him until he had the terrible misfortune of suddenly becoming a front runner. And as Jim said, I mean, that puts a huge bullseye on you, and people in my business don't want to do a certain kind of story. It takes time, takes money, takes effort. You don't want to do a certain kind of story on somebody who you regard as a peripheral candidate. But what has been happening to Newt Gingrich in the last couple of weeks, and will even more in the next few weeks, is the inevitable result of him suddenly being in double digits. And that's all it takes in this field. If you get into double digits, if you get over 20%.
He's at 24 now.
Well, I mean, that's a nosebleed if ever there was one. In this field, if you get to 24%, you are the new challenger to Mitt Romney and the new guy who can beat Barack Obama. And suddenly there will be more journalism done on Newt Gingrich in the next 3 months or 3 weeks than there has been in the last 15 years.
John?
I'm John Kingdon from the University of Michigan. I guess what I want to say more than anything is give this guy a break. I mean, think about what he's been up against. He came into office the first month he was in, the economy lost 700,000 jobs. So he's been up against this economy. He's up against a Republican Party that's been taken over by a bunch of anti-tax wackos. And they're absolutely implacable foes. There's nothing he can do by way of trying to negotiate with them or deal with them or try to make compromises with them. Number 3, he's dealing with a utterly dysfunctional U.S. Senate. I mean, it's a place that has just become just impossible to deal with. And number 4, he's dealing with an electorate that it somehow reminds me of H.L. Mencken's observation that no politician ever lost an election by overestimating the intelligence of the American voter. And so when it comes to taxes and spending and that sort of thing, the American electorate wants these government benefits and they don't want to pay for them. That's the bottom line, and it's really hard to deal with them. Now, in view of all of that, he's really accomplished quite a lot, as many of you sort of recounted, and I could go through them again. My puzzlement is Scott Lilly's puzzlement. Why hasn't all of his accomplishments been communicated better? I mean, and why hasn't he bragged about keeping cops and teachers in the classroom and so on? I mean, that's really my big puzzle. I mean, why hasn't he been able to communicate this to voters, and
John,
will he be able to do it better
John,
when it comes to the election campaign?
Sorry, John, it's all in the book. We agree with you. It's an objective evaluation looking at context and the context that you've described and the accomplishments. And it's in there. One thing that we haven't talked about, we haven't picked on the media. We should pick on the media a little bit here because he has communicated these things. He just didn't keep the message simple and repeat it. He has bragged a little bit, then he moved on to other things. as the media moves on to other things, and they don't focus on it in great detail. So Ron, it's the media's fault.
I thought the panel was fair and balanced myself. But,
I'd like to pick up a little on what Jim said. One of the problems, and we all, it's for obvious reasons, is that news is defined as something new. So it really is hard. Well, and bad, yeah. It is hard to get coverage. Even the president doesn't. If you look at, say, the schedule that you will get on a lot of the sort of Congress, White House type press sites, websites, and see what Obama is talking about or what he's said, and he does repeat it over and over again, but it doesn't get much coverage because it isn't new, and that is problematical. And also, as I think we've kind of lost sight of a little up here, presidents really do have to deal with a lot of different things at once. It's not as if they can say, well, this month, this is all we're going to deal with. Things happen. Things have to be dealt with, and not just that, but if you want legislation or regulations to come out, you have to kind of push them along, et cetera.
Scott, thank you for correcting me on the Cool Hand Luke line, get the right movie.
I agree with that, but at the same time, when I was a junior LA on Capitol Hill, I learned pretty quickly that the thing that you spent all day working on was not necessarily what you wrote your press release about. And I don't think the White House has really grasped that fact, and I think it's just inexperience. I can't put it anything else. The central explanation that I have for why such a good communicator is such a lousy communicator is there's an old political operative in Washington named Paul Tully. He died years ago, but a number of people here probably know him. They just had a kind of a ceremony for him a week or two ago, and he would always go in and make a presentation. He'd say every political situation is a contest, and it's made up of 4 points, and he'd draw a grid on the board, and there would be these 4 boxes, and he'd say, what you say about your opponent, what your opponent says about you, what you say about yourself, and what your opponent says about himself. And those 4 things drive every campaign and every political struggle. And it's remarkably simple. It's almost, you feel silly saying it. This White House does not understand that. That's what they don't get, and it's because, as Ron said, he wants to mediate. He wants this process to be other than what it is, and he refuses to get into that box. Drives him crazy. He won't do it, and he gets killed because he won't do it.
There's another aspect here. When I talked to David Axelrod for this chapter, he said, well, we're a little bit like a football team that had the greatest running back in history. I think he was thinking about the Chicago Bears and Gale Sayers, actually. And he says the temptation when you are that football team is to give the ball to Gale Sayers on every play. And he was obviously saying that Barack Obama was the greatest running back in history in terms of political communication. And certainly it did seem for periods of 2007 and 2008 as though he were taking that game to a new level and inspiring people who had never heard of him 15 minutes earlier to do things they had never done before. And of course the people around him saw him in those kind of almost messianic terms, even the ones who had been in politics for the longest period of time. And I think they were unable to turn the corner when they got into the White House and realized that instead of making you bigger, going from the campaign trail into the White House actually in many ways makes you look smaller. It's like the telescope has been turned around, and suddenly everything you do is examined in a different kind of way. There's no one to be against. You're responsible for everything, and the media, as we were all just sort of muttering under our breath, it has to be new and it has to be bad. It's not a story if it's what it's supposed to be.
One
if
last
it's
question,
okay.
and then we'll carry this conversation across the hall to a reception, but this woman right here in the middle. Let's see who gets to her first.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Kathleen Gomes. I'm the Washington correspondent for a daily Portuguese newspaper called Público. My question is Obama risk averse by nature, or has he just been cautious because he wants to get reelected? And do you think that he will take some bolder actions if he does get reelection, precisely because the electoral pressures won't be there anymore?
Good question.
I think it's by nature. I think he's a very calculating man, which is a good thing, I think. And I think he is very much, when people say he gets people in a room, and if someone doesn't talk, he directs them to say their opinion and everything. He doesn't want to be blindsided. He wants to anticipate things that might happen as a result, and I think he's just a cautious, careful person. And I think that is what got ahead for him. Now, there are a couple of places where he hasn't been cautious and careful. I think one was when he challenged Bobby Rush in 2000. He just went right into it because he wanted to be elected. I think when he started off against Hillary Clinton, without thinking about her numbers and her money, he just ran into it. I think on the issue of health care, it was very personally important to him, and as I said before, he goes the extra mile. But on most issues, he's very analytic, and he's very careful and very calculated.
Let me just conclude, since David Axelrod's name was mentioned, with a little quote that was in John Owen's chapter, which he said, Axelrod worried that Obama, and this is after he was elected president and already in office for about a year, Axelrod worried that Obama was losing his brand as a Washington outsider and becoming too identified as a leader of the Congress. So it's probably no surprise that Obama is now running against the Congress as he runs for the presidency, even though Harry Reid is not too thrilled with that prospect. So with that, please join me in thanking the panel and join us for a reception across the hall.